The door to the commercial department of a large trading company swung wide open, banging loudly against the stopper. The employees, seeing the newcomer, fell silent for a moment, before a flurry of mouse clicks filled the office as they hastily minimized or closed tabs with non-work-related content. No one wants to be in the crosshairs of Craig. The team frankly disliked their ambitious boss, but had to tolerate him without complaint, as he was the general director's son. Benjamin Norris adored his offspring without measure and was incredibly proud of him. Consequently, as soon as his son returned from studying at a prestigious university, a position as Deputy Director for Commercial Affairs and Development was instantly created for him. The new boss made no effort to understand the nuances of the work process, considered his opinion the only correct one, and treated his subordinates like powerless serfs. At times, he would transform into a despot, easily depriving anyone who fell under his angry gaze of their bonuses. The radio continued to mumble unintelligibly, broadcasting another Wonder's love laments, as Craig, without wasting time on greetings, demanded, "Who is Hayward here?" A girl at the table near the wall responded, "It's me." The man, threateningly shaking a stack of papers, approached her table and thundered, "Hayward, why is such a gross mistake made here? Do you have poor eyesight, or no eyes at all?" "My eyesight is fine. I have eyes," the young brunette replied artlessly, more out of fear than a desire to infuriate her shouting boss. "Mr. Norris, my report is correct. I checked it several times." "So, it's not your eyesight, but worse, your brain isn't right." The furious man threw the stack of papers onto his subordinate's desk. "Explain where these numbers came from. Did you not do well in school? Does 2 + 2 equal 5 to you? Have you never heard of Excel formulas? We've got enough pretty little fools without you. Well, I'll deal with all the lazy and untalented ones. Those who don't want to work or don't know how to work can quickly hit the street." Andrea Hayward, at whom Craig had just hurled so many insults, looked at the papers on her desk and suddenly burst out laughing. The sound left her colleagues stunned. The deputy director turned purple, but didn't have an opportunity to unleash another derogatory tirade. The girl stood up, handed the enraged boss the papers he had thrown, and said, "Craig, you're in the wrong place. The document you're so dissatisfied with is an accounting report. Its author is my namesake, Saida Hayward. She works in the accounting department next door." "Then why did you respond?" the man continued, indignant and oblivious to what he was being told. The girl patiently explained. "I told you that Saida and I are namesakes. My name is Andrea." Her colleagues tried to disguise their laughter as coughing and sneezing, which only angered Craig further. He prepared to say something, but Andrea beat him to it. "You mixed up the departments, but I'm glad you did. If you hadn't just yelled at me out of a bad mood and power trip, I'd probably still be sitting here, trembling like a leaf. But that's enough. I quit. I hope you or your father won't make me work 2 weeks' notice or withhold my dismissal. Otherwise, I'll have to go to the Labour Inspectorate. I have nothing to lose." In truth, Andrea wanted to say much more to the nasty tyrant, but she held back. What was the point of wasting her time? The pompous and overconfident Craig was unlikely to realize quickly that his odious leadership style would lead nowhere good. So, the girl simply sat down, quickly typed out her resignation, printed the document, and turned off her computer. Andrea reached the general director's office without any problems. The tone of Mr. Norris, who saw his subordinate's resignation letter and was clearly unaware of his son's conflict with the manager, was almost affectionate. "Why are you leaving our friendly team? What's wrong?" At that moment, Craig burst into the office without knocking and said in a petulant voice, "Fire her! Don't even think twice. Such employees shouldn't work for us. If I were you, father, I would have gotten rid of this insolent lady yesterday." Andrea, usually silent and modest, was so offended that she became indignant. "Craig, how am I insolent? I simply pointed out that you mixed up the departments and started yelling at me unreasonably." "Actually, I have every right to point out mistakes in documents," Craig snapped back, toning it down a bit, but that did nothing to calm Andrea. "If you only wanted to point out an error in a document, you would have called the internal phone number, which, by the way, is listed under the name of the author. But that wasn't good enough for you. You wanted to show what a big boss you are. That's why you burst into the office and started yelling at me without making any sense. You see, Father, no respect for the chain of command. Fire her immediately. What an impertinent one. She humiliates the bosses in public, undermines my authority in the company, and this will negatively affect our results. I'm sure of it. She's being clever and pointing out mistakes. And why are the signs in the corridor hanging so strangely? It's unclear where to enter." Andrea sighed tiredly. She was in a bad mood even without this unpleasant turmoil. Her relationship with her boyfriend Jim had broken down, and now on top of her plate she had to look for a new job. Mr. Norris shifted his gaze from his son to the employee, pondered for a moment, then asked the girl directly, "Do you agree to be dismissed today? Of course, with payment of all that is due under the law." "Yes," Andrea answered briefly, and after a few seconds took the statement signed by the director. "I'll instruct the accounting department to ensure you're paid without delay and fairly," Mr. Norris informed her, "and the personnel department will tell you what else is required of you." All formalities were settled before the lunch break. Apparently the director decided to demonstrate that he kept his word. However, it didn't matter so much now. Colleagues, stunned by the rapid dismissal of a hard-working and modest girl, said many nice words to her and wished her well in finding a wonderful job. Andrea didn't want to go home. She could go to the store, buy delicacies, cook a delicious dinner and celebrate a new stage of her life with her favourite man. Except that Jim's workday at the car service was irregular. In fact, he could work, as they say, until the last client. Meanwhile, the girl became sad. She didn't want to be alone now. Andrea understood perfectly well that all her optimism about the dismissal was nothing more than bravado in front of colleagues and bosses who, she thought, weren't upset about her departure. Certainly, it was she who should be sad. Where to go now to look for a job? Would it be possible to find a vacancy with a normal salary, and preferably with a good team? Andrea understood perfectly well that nothing particularly lucrative or prestigious would be available to her. After all, she wasn't a daughter, wife, or even a distant relative of a rich or powerful man, so she would have to work hard and be content with a modest position and salary. Jim was unlikely to help with work, no matter how sad it was to admit. She was just a cohabitant to him, and for almost 2 years. He was in no hurry to propose. Her timid hints, made a couple of times, Jim seemed not to notice, or immediately changed the subject. Andrea, of course, was offended to feel in a suspended state, but she feared that a direct, frank conversation about legalizing their relationship would put an end to it. So now she kept silent about the desired marriage, and didn't even stutter about the fact that she would like to become a mother. Lost in unhappy thoughts, Andrea didn't notice that her feet had brought her to the shopping centre. The girl stepped through the doors, which opened to her liking, and found herself in a realm of boutiques and small shops, cell phone salons, and stalls where staff would give her a manicure and even apply makeup. The top floor of the centre was occupied by cinema halls and a food court, but Andrea didn't want to go there at all. Taking advantage of the moment, she decided to look for a new down jacket for the rapidly approaching winter. After all, even despite the dismissal and the prospect of austerity, it was still necessary to stay warm. But her mood wasn't the most suitable for shopping, and after about an hour, tired and sweating, she went to get groceries. The bags were unexpectedly heavy, and deciding to be clever, Andrea called a cab from the shopping centre to Jim's work, so they could return home together At the beginning of their relationship, they'd done that often. Andrea would sit quietly in the room, equipped for clients, who sometimes stayed to wait for the end of car repair work. When Jim finished work, he'd take Andrea's hand and lead her to his apartment, or, if he had a car and the weather allowed, he'd drive her around the city. On the way, they would stop at a fast food joint and pick up some food to eat outdoors. It was so romantic, but lately, Andrea couldn't remember when they had spent such a nice time together. Because of the frantic and aimless shopping, the girl didn't think to call her beloved. She only thought about it when she entered the waiting room to put down her purchases before heading to the body repair area where Jim usually worked. However, her plans were thwarted because Andrea saw her favourite a little earlier than she expected, but there was no joy in it. Jim was sprawled on the sofa, embracing some blonde. That's right. If the day starts out bad, then by evening nothing good will come of it, Andrea thought bitterly. Jim looked pleased, even happy. The man didn't even think of pulling away from the girl, unfamiliar to Andrea, and asked in a calm, not at all embarrassed tone, "Why did you come?" "Just stopping by, out of old friendship," Andrea replied coolly. Then she turned around and went to Jim's apartment to get her things. Surprisingly, she didn't feel like making a scene at all. Probably she had exhausted her limit on conflicts earlier that day at her former job. It didn't take long to pack her things. Andrea grinned sadly, realizing that all her stuff fit into the same 2 bags she had brought to Jim's apartment. She hadn't accumulated much. The girl looked around. She remembered how she had invested in repairs, updating furniture, appliances, thinking that she should help her beloved. What a fool. She hadn't even considered that she might have to leave this cosy place after Jim's betrayal. After all, her friend Vanessa had warned her not to spend her savings on her boyfriend's apartment, but to no avail. They had even quarrelled just a month ago when Andrea told her about buying a coffee machine. Vanessa had twirled her finger at Andrea and, quite accurately as it turned out, predicted, "Jim will leave you. Remember my words. If after a year of dating, a man hasn't made a marriage proposal, then he won't do it, especially when even long cohabitation hasn't pushed him to take this important step. There's nothing to wait for." Andrea angrily dismissed her friend's concerns, claiming that there was nothing to discuss. She accused her friend of jealousy, boasting that Jim had his own apartment and a job. Andrea went even more far. She called Vanessa's Tom a lazy moron. Deeply offended, Vanessa cut off communication with Andrea. Time, however, proved Vanessa right. Andrea eventually realized she had merely been funding Jim's apartment renovations. Suppressing her urge for retaliation, Andrea's better judgment prevailed. She gathered her bags and groceries, locked the door, and dropped her keys in the mailbox for the deceitful Jim before leaving. Stepping onto the city streets, Andrea felt the cool autumn evening settling in. She urgently needed to find a place to stay for the night, but her options were limited. Andrea tried calling her only relative, older sister, but the phone was unavailable. The girl was sure that her older sister Nancy was at home now, so she even got a little angry. Despite their past issues, surely Nancy could have answered the call. Deciding that an unannounced visit was justified under her difficult circumstances, Andrea opted to walk rather than spend money on a cab. She headed towards the house, where she once was happy and needed, now occupied by her sister's family. Bittersweet memories flooded back as Andrea approached, making each step feel heavier. As the familiar entrance came into view, Andrea's throat tightened, and tears welled up in her eyes for the first time that difficult day. She didn't have the keys to the intercom, so she dialed the number of the apartment where she had spent her childhood. "Nancy, it's me. Can you let me in?" Andrea asked upon hearing her sister's voice through the speaker. "All right, come on up," Nancy replied. Andrea tried to convince herself that she had only imagined the displeasure in Nancy's tone as she hurried up to the apartment. The chilly reception, however, confirmed her fears. Nancy didn't rush to embrace her younger sister, despite not having seen each other for months. She didn't even invite Andrea to the kitchen, where the sounds of her husband and sons having dinner could be heard. Noticing the bags Andrea carried, Nancy asked flatly, "What's happened to you, Andrea?" "A lot, Nancy. To cut a long story short, I resigned from my job today and broke up with Jim. I was hoping I could stay here for a while until I find a new apartment and job." Nancy's refusal, though not entirely unexpected, still stung Andrea. "I sympathise with you, of course, but this isn't the right place for you to stay. You know how you and Sam can't stand each other. You're bound to quarrel, even if you just cross paths in the kitchen. I shouldn't deal with that stress right now." Nancy stroked her belly, which didn't look especially noticeable on her figure, which had grown fat after the birth of 2 children. Andrea tried to be polite. "Well, congratulations." Andrea's nephews burst into the hallway shouting, "Hello!" before rushing to their room, arguing about which game to play on the console. Their father appeared shortly after. Upon seeing Andrea, he grimaced, not even attempting to hide his dislike. "Well, well, I hope you won't stay long." Andrea shot back, "Don't you worry, Sam, I'll be gone soon, and you can continue spoiling my sister's life uninterrupted." Attempting to diffuse the conflict, Nancy turned to her husband. "Sam, please deal with the boys before they start fighting over the game." Unperturbed by Andrea's presence, Sam, picking his teeth, headed for the nursery, casting only a dismissive glance at her. Nancy tried to smooth over the awkwardness. "Come on, I'll make some tea and feed you. You must be hungry. I can't help with much else, but there are plenty of lodging options now. Hotels, hostels, you name it." Andrea declined, but Nancy, feeling guilty about refusing her sister, offered, "At least leave some of your things here, so you're not carrying such a heavy load. You can collect them once you've found a place. I can also ask about job vacancies. I could get you a sales position right away." "Thank you, Nancy. I really appreciate your support and suggestions," Andrea replied. "I'd prefer to leave my things here for now, and I'll pass on the food. I need to arrange a place to sleep." "All right, let's put your things in the closet. Then we'll go to the kitchen, and you can search for a place to stay." Andrea handed her sister the grocery bag. "Here are the groceries. I'd planned a celebratory dinner for quitting my job, but then decided not to leave the delicacies for Jim. Too much for him." Nancy sighed. She had never liked her sister's boyfriend. She felt partly responsible for Andrea's situation, knowing that she had moved in with Jim out of desperation rather than overwhelming love. It had become unbearable for Andrea to stay in her parents' apartment. While Andrea searched for accommodation, Nancy warmed up soup, mashed potatoes and cutlets, setting the table and brewing fresh tea. "I can't let you go hungry. Let's eat, and then you can continue your search. I'll call you tomorrow afternoon, or you call me." Andrea suddenly remembered. "Nancy, is your phone not working? I tried to call and warn you as I was coming, but I couldn't get through." "Oh, the boys must have messed with it again," Nancy exclaimed. "They still use push-button phones, but sometimes they beg to play games on mine, as if the console isn't enough. Sam insisted on buying it, saying our son's dream should come true. He spent a fortune on that thing. And we have to keep buying new games for it too." The aromas wafting from the food were so homey and familiar that Andrea, despite thinking she couldn't eat a bite, discreetly cleared all the plates and emptied her teacup. "Nancy, thank you so much. I didn't realize how hungry I was until I tasted it. It's delicious. As if our mum had cooked it herself." Nancy smiled sadly. Though a mother herself, she still desperately missed her parents, who had died 7 years ago in a terrible accident. The wound of loss had never healed. Trying to cope with her grief, Nancy had slowly begun mastering recipes from her mother's cookbook, which contained the most successful versions of various dishes, from baked goods to winter preserves. "You're welcome, sis. the hostess said. After a moment of silence, Nancy added, "I apologise for everything, but I really can't let you stay overnight." "It's all right, Nancy, I understand. Please forgive me as well. I wasn't very gentle with my words back then either." Probably the sisters would have started crying, but at that moment Sam came into the kitchen and said, "Nancy, go deal with your brats yourself. All you want to do is talk. Your real family isn't important to you." Andrea didn't bother reminding him that she was part of the family and rose to leave. Risking her husband's displeasure, Nancy asked her younger sister, "Where will you go, Andrea? You haven't had an opportunity to find a place to live yet." Trying to appear as carefree as possible, Andrea improvised. "Oh, I'll call Vanessa. She lives in our neighbourhood, so it won't take long to get there." "Nancy, can't you hear the screaming in the nursery? Say goodbye to your sister and go deal with it." Much to Andrea's annoyance, Nancy hurriedly said goodbye and went to fulfil her repressive and lazy husband's demands. Andrea left the apartment and once on the street called her friend with whom she had been quarrelling. Vanessa responded almost instantly, and without even asking the reason for the call, immediately invited her over. It wasn't far. The old 5-story building, recently painted a cheerful fuchsia, was just a block away. And half an hour later, her friend invited her cordially, as if there had been no quarrel between them. "Come in, Andrea. Tom's working the night shift. If you don't have to get up early, we can sit and chat at our leisure. I've made dinner. Would you like to eat?" Vanessa acted as if there had been no spat. So Andrea dared to address the urgent issue at hand. "No thanks, I'm not hungry. My sister fed me to the brim, Vanessa. I have a more pressing problem than hunger. I have nowhere to live. I know your space is tight, but please, take me in for at least a few days." Vanessa waved her hands. "Well, I have no objection at all. The living room is all yours." "Thank you, Vanessa. All I want is a roof over my head. Jim and I had a fight, just as you predicted. I was very wrong about him." The friend, realizing Andrea would share her troubles, didn't interfere in Andrea's confess, and so it happened. It took only one question. "I still don't understand why you and your sister quarrelled so sharply then. Wasn't everything amicable at first glance? You even took your nephews out more often than she did. I'm sorry, of course, but I've always thought that you and Jim only started living together out of desperation." Andrea nodded. "You're right again. I ran away from home. I haven't told anyone about it, but I feel like I'll burst if I don't share it with someone." When our parents were still alive and Nancy was pregnant with her oldest son, she moved back home. It all happened because Sam started having problems in his business, and he even had to sell their apartment. We were cramped, but all in good spirits. We hoped that soon enough my brother-in-law would earn enough to buy a house again. And then, as you know, my parents died. I didn't care about the legal formalities. I did as Sam advised. I refused to inherit from my parents. He explained it would cost less, and I didn't have much money. I didn't expect any trickery. Nancy and I had become incredibly close. Matt was only a year old, and he, frankly speaking, became our salvation from all this nightmare. Taking care of him was all that kept us going. Then Lee was born, and Matt started school. And then, as if a black cat ran between Nancy and me, our relationship deteriorated sharply. Sam, who had rejoiced when I refused the inheritance and assured me that the doors of my father's house were always open to me, changed. He said my presence was no longer desirable. Nancy supported him. I didn't tell anyone, but she accused me of flirting with Sam, and he, the jerk, as I realise now, managed to convince her of that. But the most hurtful thing was that my nephews, who were so fond of me, suddenly cooled towards me. Today they greeted me as if I were a stranger, and that's how it goes in my life. First everything's great, and then it all goes wrong. With you, too, as you remember, a quarrel almost out of the blue. With Jim? It's not clear what happened at all. Vanessa almost jumped on the spot, blurting out, "Andrea, you must have been jinxed. Well, not jinxed. I've read about it. Everything seems fine, then bang, it all falls apart like a sandcastle." "Oh, it's nothing. I probably just don't handle conflicts well. What's the big deal? Today, I could have simply told that puffed-up turkey Craig that he mixed up the offices, but no, I didn't think I could lose my job and started mocking him. As a result, I'm sitting here now, disturbing your rest." However, Vanessa was sure of her stance and continued to convince her friend. "No, Andrea, all sorts of mystical things aren't nonsense. I have a co-worker. She was suffering too. Everything was going wrong for her, and then one day, her problems started falling away, like dried mud, almost as if by magic. Well, of course the girls and I pestered her with questions, and she admitted that she had gone to a fortune teller. We, of course, also began asking to share the sorceress's contacts. Reluctantly, she shared. Only she turned out to be quite selective. She doesn't agree to read fortunes for just anyone. She'll talk on the phone beforehand, listen to just a few phrases, and immediately reject some people, saying there's no point in them coming to her and that she won't agree to read their fortune. She arranges meetings with others. She agreed to see me only once, about 1.5 years ago. She drew the cards and told me what to do and how to do it." "Oh, Vanessa, are you kidding me? How did you fall for such a thing? All magicians and fortune tellers, psychics, and the like are just swindlers with good psychological skills. They take advantage of people's gullibility and swindle money. I don't believe in crystal balls and magic cards." Vanessa didn't back down. "Maybe you're partly right. I didn't believe it myself either, but Mary is not a fraud in any way. She doesn't even ask for payment in money, but in products. Listen, Andrea, what do you have to lose if you go to this fortune teller? At least it won't get worse." "That's for sure. It just can't get any worse. You just need to call Mary beforehand and make an appointment. Well, shall I give you the fortune teller's phone number? Or are you going to keep suffering like this?" Andrea smiled. Her mood gradually improved from communicating with her cheerful and straightforward friend, as it always did. And again, she didn't want to end a difficult day with another quarrel. "Go ahead, Vanessa. What choice do I have? I know you. If you've decided to do me good, you won't leave me alone." "That's right, I won't." "Maybe she won't agree to see me," Andrea muttered quietly, entering the sequence of numbers dictated by her friend into her smartphone. Making sure Andrea had noted the number correctly, Vanessa summarized. "It's getting late now. You call her in the morning. Be sure to do it. I can't control it, unfortunately. I have to go to work early. But be warned, I'll demand a full report from you. I'll let Tom know you're our guest, so rest easy." In the morning, Andrea dialed the fortune teller's number. After a couple of rings, a young voice answered. It lacked the hoarseness or any mystical qualities the girl had expected. The fortune teller, Mary, asked about the nature of her inquiry, paused briefly, then agreed to see her. She set the time for their session and gave directions. Meanwhile, Vanessa's husband returned home. He greeted Andrea discreetly, and she, to avoid complications, and not to disturb his rest after the night shift, hastily departed. Over breakfast at the bakery, the girl pondered the changes of the past 24 hours. Just yesterday, she had planned her workdays and weekend plans with Jim at this very table. Today, she had nowhere to rush. All that remained was to browse job ads and await Nancy's call. Perhaps she could find a suitable position. After the breakfast, Andrea wandered through stores, not for shopping but to scrutinize the advertisements on bulletin boards and doors. She even considered retail, knowing vacancies were plentiful in that field. This potential job offered at least the illusion that she wouldn't starve. Finally, Andrea bought groceries to pay the fortune teller and set off. The bus was crowded, with no available seats. The heavy bag weighed down her arm, and she mentally chided herself for embarking on what she feared might be a futile adventure. Mary's dwelling turned out to be a small wooden house, nestled in the shadow of newly built high-rises. Compared to them, it seemed a faded relic of the past. Yet how cosy this relic was, despite the towering buildings clearly blocking sunlight from the yard. Colourful asters and other flowers Andrea couldn't name bloomed behind a low wooden fence. In this vibrant oasis, improbably thriving in the urban jungle, the typical city smell of exhaust fumes was absent. Instead, like a greeting from a distant childhood, the fragrance of linden blossoms filled the air, quite unexpected for mid-autumn. Andrea snorted incredulously. Could this surprising aroma be the start of an elaborate ruse? Is there a hidden diffuser somewhere spraying scent, making the client feel they're in some truly magical place? After such preparation, even nonsense might be perceived so critically. Mary, who emerged onto the porch accompanied by a large striped cat, gave Andrea a mixed impression. There was no witchy flair to the hostess's attire, just a simple, light cotton dress and cosy, thick, hand-knitted slippers. No colourful scarves, amulets, or other mystical accoutrements. "Good of you not to be late," Mary praised instead of a greeting. "Come in." Andrea opened the gate, squinting at the riotously colourful flowers, approached the porch and said hello. The cat leapt down from the steps and rubbed against the guest's jeans, seeking attention. Watching this, the hostess said, "Mars, stop pestering, let her pass." "Contrary to what you think, Andrea didn't come here to pet you, but on business." "Come in," the fortune-teller repeated. "Mars isn't rushing, but you and I have work to do. Put the bag on the table in the hall." Andrea followed Mary, then sat modestly on the chair her hostess indicated. The room also lacked any witchy ambience. Instead, featuring a confusing mix of styles and eras, a hand-knitted tablecloth was protected by modern flexible glass. An ultra-trendy ergonomic chair stood next to an antique dresser. A modern laptop occupied the computer desk. Mary hissed at the cat, who was sniffing curiously at Andrea's package. She took out a deck of large cards and began shuffling them while scrutinizing her visitor. Suddenly, instead of explaining her problems, Andrea blurted out, sincerely, "Your cat is wonderful. I wish you'd told me about him. I'd have brought treats. Your flowers are also incredibly beautiful. It's surprising they bloom in such low-light conditions. I even thought I smelled linden blossoms." The fortune-teller nodded silently at the compliments. Upon hearing about the unusual aroma, she smiled and said, "Is that so? You smelled linden? Very interesting." Then she handed the visitor a deck with the cards face down and instructed, "Shuffle them yourself." Andrea obeyed, and Mary began laying out the cards with their beautiful images. The fortune-teller studied them carefully, but, contrary to the client's expectations, didn't begin to narrate past, present, and future. Instead, she gathered all the cards from the table again and said, "You'll soon face a choice, to act rationally or follow your heart. Your fate will depend on your decision. If you heed your mind, one path opens. If you follow your emotions, you'll find yourself in quite a tale, and this trial will make you better and stronger than you are now." The fortune-teller fell silent, discreetly removed the cards and stood up, signalling the end of the session. Andrea felt slightly cheated, as the entire consultation had lasted barely 3 minutes. The girl gathered her courage and asked, "Is that all?" The fortune-teller nodded. Andrea, deciding not to confront her, ended the conversation politely. "All right. Mary, thank you." She stroked the cat, which had returned for more affection, and bid farewell to the fortune-teller. Mary added, "Andrea, don't betray yourself. Act according to your conscience, and everything will turn out right for you. Goodbye." "Goodbye," Andrea replied. With no pressing engagements, Andrea decided to go for a walk. The wind had suddenly died down, as if by conspiracy, and the clouds had scattered, freeing the sun from its prison. The weather was pleasant. Thinking she should take advantage of nature's gift, perhaps the last warmth of the fading autumn, she headed to the park a few blocks away. Halfway there, Andrea received a call from Vanessa, who was eager to know about her friend's visit to the fortune-teller. "Come on, tell me how it went. What did Mary say to you?" Andrea's opinion was harsh, and she didn't mince words with her friend. "My opinion hasn't changed. Fortune-telling is nonsense. Mary just spouted philosophical gibberish, generic phrases that could apply to anyone." "Wait, tell me in detail. How did it go?" Realizing the conversation might drag on, Andrea, who had reached the park, sat down on the nearest bench. An old-fashioned plaid coat lay on one edge, but it didn't bother her. She figured the owner might have removed it to exercise and would return soon. Yielding to her friend's insistence, Andrea recounted the visit to the fortune-teller in detail. Vanessa was genuinely surprised. "Listen, I don't understand at all. It's as if you saw an entirely different woman. Even the description doesn't match. But that's not the point. Mary I talked to had a totally different demeanour. She spoke at length, dealt cards and drew extras. She must have talked to me for about 40 minutes. Strange." An apologetic note crept into Vanessa's voice, and Andrea reassured her friend. "It's no big deal. I don't regret going at all. I got out, distracted myself from silly worries, and that's good. Plus, I got to pet a beautiful cat." "Well, it's good you can find the positive in everything. Oh, and I meant to say, in all the rush I forgot to give you the apartment keys. Tom and I are going to the movies. Want to join us?" "No, thanks, Vanessa. I don't have time for a movie." "Don't worry, I'll find a place to stay. Just let me know when you'll be back." Vanessa gave an estimated return time and hurriedly said goodbye. "Okay, we've got to run. See you later." Andrea moved the smartphone from her ear, glanced at the screen, and tucked it into her pocket. She was surprised to realise she'd been chatting with her friend for nearly half an hour, and the coat's owner still hadn't returned. Meanwhile, the weather had suddenly changed. The sun, as if ashamed of its unseasonable warmth, hid behind leaden grey clouds. A steady rain began to fall. Andrea was about to leave when she felt a sudden concern for the coat's owner. What could have happened? Judging by the coat's style, its owner wasn't young, and there could have been health issues. Mentally praising herself for bringing an umbrella, Andrea opened it and stood up, moving to shield the coat from the rain. She didn't sit down, but twisted in place, searching for the unknown owner. She considered the possibility that the coat, no longer needed and perhaps too large for its owner, had been left for someone else to take. But usually such charitable donations were left near trash bins. Who would stage such a giveaway in the park, where the chances of someone taking it were much lower? Andrea increasingly worried that the coat's owner might have had an accident. She picked up the coat, intending to check its pockets for a phone or perhaps a document, but suddenly felt uncomfortable. Rummaging through someone else's belongings felt invasive and wrong. The fortune-teller's words suddenly came to mind. Logically, she should leave the coat where it was and go to a cafe to wait until it was time to return to Tom and Vanessa's apartment. But her conscience wouldn't allow it. How could she live with herself if she had left a helpless person in an almost deserted park? Andrea bristled at the strange realization that she indeed faced the most difficult choice the fortune-teller had mentioned. Sighing, she pulled a wallet from the stranger's coat pocket. As expected, it was nearly empty. Inside was only a receipt from a chain pharmacy. The name of the purchased blood pressure medication indirectly confirmed her guess that the coat's owner was an elderly woman. However, the payment was made in cash. This receipt would only be useful if the pharmacy had video surveillance and would allow her to view the footage to see who had made the purchase. But it was unlikely that a private individual would be granted access to such information. After a few more minutes, Andrea picked up her coat and walked through the park, hoping to find the owner of the lost item. The park was almost deserted, and none of the few passers-by she stopped had seen an elderly woman without outerwear. Guided by some sixth sense, Andrea climbed up to the stage of the dilapidated summer bandstand and noticed an object in the corner. Cautiously approaching, she almost shrieked with fright, realizing that an unconscious elderly woman lay there. Dialing emergency services, Andrea explained the situation to the operator. A calm female voice advised her how to act without harming the woman and instructed her to wait for the ambulance. Andrea covered the unfortunate woman with her own coat to keep her warm while waiting. After a few minutes, the woman stirred and tried to get up. An excited Andrea began talking to her, but the woman was disoriented, barely aware of her surroundings. and couldn't remember how she ended up on the stage. The arriving medics determined that the victim had a closed head injury, likely not from an accidental fall. The woman gave her name as June Rees, but couldn't provide her address. There were no documents on her, and Andrea quietly added to the conversation. "I found a coat that looks like it belongs to Mrs. Rees, but it was quite far from here in the park."
I don't remember anything,"
Mrs. Rees wailed sorrowfully.
"Someone has hit you hard on the head,"
said the paramedic sympathetically. "You need an X-ray and hospital care." Mrs. Rees was unsteady, so Andrea helped the crew escort her to the ambulance. On the way, she quietly answered the curious young nurse's questions, though she couldn't provide much information. When they reached the ambulance, the doctor suggested to Andrea, "We're taking her to the Central City Hospital. If it's convenient, come with us. Between you and me, it's better if someone's there with the patient. Also, since she's undocumented and the wound is likely criminal in origin, we'll need to record your information and talk to the police." "All right, I'd be happy to. It's actually more convenient for me from the hospital. I was just in the neighbourhood on business and happened to be in the park." They reached the hospital quickly, despite the traffic. However, Andrea ended up staying there for a long time. She even received a call from a worried Vanessa, who had already returned from the movie with Tom. "Listen, where did you disappear to? Our pizza's getting cold and you're still not here." "Vanessa, eat without me. I found an unconscious woman in the park. I'm at the hospital now. They're processing her." "Oh, Andrea, it's dangerous to let you go anywhere alone. You'll always find an adventure on your backside. Okay, call me if anything happens." With these words, Vanessa ended the call, and Andrea was summoned by the nurse. "There's a policeman and the victim's relatives waiting for you in the hall. They want to talk to you." When Andrea stepped into the hall, she was greatly surprised to see people she knew very well standing next to the uniformed man. For Craig and Benjamin Norris, the appearance of a recently fired employee was equally surprising. The policeman broke the silent scene. "As I see, it was you who found Mrs. Rees in the park." "Yes, that's the name she gave when she regained consciousness." The policeman began to ask more questions, but he was suddenly interrupted by Craig's shrill voice. "This Hayward has criminal intent written all over her face. She's seeking revenge for being dismissed by our family. She must have followed my grandmother somehow, then knocked her out in that backwater park and decided to play the noble saviour. What was she doing in that park? Ask her." Andrea was confused. The director's surname wasn't Rees at all, and it seemed impossible that he had any connection to the woman. Moreover, the clothing of the woman she found didn't match her son's social status, and of course Andrea hadn't expected to face such vile accusations for her good deed. She wasn't going to mention her visit to the fortune-teller, but otherwise she had nothing to hide. So, looking at the policeman as confidently as she could, she said she just wanted to take a walk. Then, shifting her gaze to her former superiors, she added, "As you well know, I'm unemployed now, so I can go out whenever and wherever I want." "Check it out. My grandmother's purse will probably have Hayward's fingerprints on it," Craig persisted. Andrea had to explain again
trying to be convincing. "Of course they will, because I picked up the purse and looked inside, hoping to find something that would lead to its owner." Craig continued his accusations, no longer mincing his words. "I'm telling you, she's the one who knocked my grandmother on the head. She took off her coat and then made up this silly story. No intelligence, no imagination." Seeing the resentment and anger on Andrea's face, Mr. Norris cut his son off. "That's enough, Craig. Stop making unsubstantiated accusations. Everything needs to be properly investigated. Let's leave it to the competent authorities. Currently, I'm more concerned about how Mum is feeling than anything else. I'm going to find a doctor. Come with me, Craig, because I'm afraid that you'll make a mess of things here that won't be good for anyone." The policeman, having escorted the men away with a glance, sympathetically advised Andrea. "I'm generally a good judge of character, and a pretty good one at that. Between you and me, I don't believe you're guilty, but no one can predict how the case will turn out. Judging by how this man is acting, with a watch on his arm worth as much as my car, you might need a lawyer." Andrea thanked the policeman for his advice, gave him the address of her temporary stay, and, exhausted, went to her friend's house. Upon learning the details of the incident, Vanessa became furious and began to berate Craig. "What a scoundrel! How can you do good if you get kicked for your gratitude right away? You help, and then you're the one to blame." Tom raised his voice. "By the way, the cop gave you sound advice. You should hire a lawyer. Then you should even sue this insolent man for defamation and get decent compensation." Andrea sighed heavily. Here are the trials predicted by the fortune-teller. The girl went to bed, planning to visit her sister the next morning and ask for help in finding and paying for a lawyer. Nancy, having learned about Andrea's predicament, griped. "You need a good, expensive lawyer now. You've crossed such rich people." "I didn't cross anyone's path. I just didn't pass by," Andrea protested. "And anyway, judging by that coat, which caused all this, one couldn't guess its owner was Benjamin Norris's mother. I think it's from the previous era." "All right," Nancy interrupted, stroking her belly. "I know you. You wouldn't have passed by anyway. But that's not the point now. It seems we can't even find half the fee for a decent specialist. We'll have to raise money from everyone we know. Oh, why did you have to go to that park?" "You're a fool, Andrea." Sam, present at the conversation, chimed in. "Well, you saw an unconscious woman, but why get into a fight? You should have run away from there. At the very least, you could have called an ambulance. That's all. It's better not to even give your details. They'll torture you. In the worst case, which you're now threatened with, they'll drag you through the courts." Andrea's mood plummeted. She returned to Vanessa's apartment, barely able to move her legs over her heavy thoughts. In the living room, another surprise awaited the girl, an unfamiliar man, whose features resembled Mr. Norris's. He saw her and rose from his chair. The man looked huge in the tiny room, and having bumped his head on the light fixture on the ceiling, was greatly embarrassed. Vanessa, introducing her guest, glowed like a sun. "Andrea, this is Robert Rees. He's the youngest son of the woman you rescued yesterday, and your former director, Mr. Norris, is his half-brother." The man gallantly kissed Andrea's hand and began to thank her. "Andrea, you will now always be a welcome guest in our family. Please call me Robert. I apologize for the unpleasant emotions you experienced. I can't thank you enough for being in the park at that moment and not passing by. As soon as I heard from my brother that our mum had an accident, I immediately bought a plane ticket and rushed straight to the hospital from the airport. It's a miracle that you found her. The doctor said that if it had been a little longer, the consequences of the impact would have been much more severe." Vanessa chimed in gratefully. "It's good that your family has a sensible person. Yesterday, our kind-hearted Andrea was accused of a crime by your nephew, her former boss. We've even started looking for a lawyer." Robert waved his hands dismissively. Again, I deeply apologize and am ready to compensate you for any moral damages you name. Craig is young, hot-headed and, frankly, a bit foolish. Andrea, please forgive my nephew. He always speaks before thinking and doesn't understand people at all. Neither my brother nor the hired private detective had the slightest suspicion that you were involved in the attack. I assure you, the real perpetrator won't get away with it. Benjamin and I will use every connection we have to find him. My brother's at Mum's hospital, and I'm here on his behalf to tell you that you can return to work on Monday. The position remains the same, but Benjamin has promised to increase your salary. To everyone's surprise, Andrea refused. Vanessa elbowed her, demanding an explanation. Andrea confessed, I don't think Craig will welcome my return, and he'll be looking for reasons to fire me again. Robert smiled. Well, my brother won't allow that now. But there's another option. Vanessa mentioned you have nowhere to live, and I had an idea. How would you feel about moving to another city? Is anything keeping you here? No, Andrea shrugged, except Vanessa, but I'm already abusing her hospitality and testing her husband's patience. The man smiled warmly. Then, Andrea, I invite you to the town where my mother and I live. I'll provide you with a job and a place to live, guaranteed. You are very brave and kind, and this should be rewarded. After her sudden dismissal and parting with Jim, Andrea never imagined so many events would unfold in her life at once. But thanks to a visit to a fortune-teller, everything came together in the most incredible way. Until the doctor cleared Mrs. Rees for safe travel, Andrea stayed in a hotel room paid for by Robert. He was staying with his brother, but tried to see Andrea almost daily. He explained her future duties in her new position, and she familiarized him with her hometown. Mum used to live here with Benjamin's father, but when she left most of her things behind. I don't know exactly what their story was, but my mother took only Benjamin with her. She divorced and then married my father, Kenneth Rees. I was born in that marriage. My brother, who is 10 years older than me, kept his father's surname. Robert told his mother's life story to Andrea. Meanwhile, the meetings between Robert and Andrea grew increasingly cordial. The girl barely remembered Jim, the traitor, and was even glad they had parted. She realized she was falling in love with this gallant man, and there was nothing she could do about it. When it turned out he was also free from obligations, her joy knew no bounds. A year after Andrea found Mrs. Rees barely alive in the park, the girl became her daughter-in-law. Relations with her mother-in-law were very tender. Robert doted on Andrea, and she lived feeling infinitely happy. They travelled to work together and happily returned home in the evening. Time passed, and everything was wonderful for the Reeses, except that they couldn't please Mrs. Rees with a grandchild. Doctors said there were no obstacles to pregnancy, but it didn't happen. Andrea was prescribed various treatments, but to no avail. One day, Andrea dreamed of the fortune-teller's house, with the cat Mars sitting on the porch and washing itself. She even smelled the delightful scent of blooming linden, but Mary herself didn't appear in the dream. After waking, Andrea had a keen desire to thank Mary. She told her husband she had to go to her hometown for a while and set off on her trip. The fortune-teller didn't answer calls, so right from the airport, Andrea picked up some groceries, including food for good-natured Mars, and went to the address she knew. However, to her great amazement, construction work was in full swing where the house and well-tended front garden had been. The area was surrounded by a metal fence, and a large billboard informed the curious that a construction company was building a kindergarten under the municipal program. In a small booth by the gate sat a guard who opened and closed the barrier, occasionally glancing at documents from the drivers. Andrea saw trucks passing by, emitting puffs of black, stinking smoke. She turned to leave, but suddenly stopped, as if she'd run into an invisible wall. The scent of linden blossoms was too distinct. It wasn't just incredible, it was impossible. How could such a subtle fragrance break through the parade of trucks? At that moment, a guard approached the bewildered woman. "Hey, what do you want here? This is no place for a stroll. Can't you see there's construction going on?"
"Excuse me, I just want to ask you a question," Andrea replied. "I realise the odds are slim, but do you happen to know where Mary, the owner of the house that used to stand here, has moved? I'd like to see her. I've brought some presents."
The guard whistled. "Oh, girl, as it happens, I do know about that. I've got a brother-in-law in the fire department." The man stepped back to open the barrier for another truck, and Andrea stood there, confused about the relevance of his brother-in-law. However, the guard soon returned and continued his story with stunning news. "Well, you can't give your presents to Mary. Her house caught fire at night 6 months ago. When they put it out, they found her body inside. The strangest thing is that she wasn't hurt at all. She must have slept and inhaled the poisonous smoke without noticing. But now the house has been demolished, and now work is in full swing."
"Excuse me, did your relative say anything about the cat?" Andrea asked, taking advantage of a pause in the man's words.
"No," the guard shook his head. "He didn't mention anything. All right, girl, you'd better go. I have to work."
Andrea held out a bag of food to the man. "Here, take this for the information, and to remember Mary. She was a good woman."
"Thank you from the bottom of my heart. I forgot my lunch bag today."
Andrea added, "There's some cat food in the bag. If a cat comes around, please feed it." The guard assured her he would keep his promise. Andrea said goodbye and walked to the bus stop, thinking about how gratitude in life should be timely. Should she have come earlier? She had been enjoying her happiness without thinking of others. Just as it had a few years ago when she found her future mother-in-law in the park, rain began to sprinkle. Under the flimsy protection of the polycarbonate roof, quite a few people were already waiting for transportation. Andrea stayed outside with her hood up. She was lost in unhappy thoughts about the house burning down for a reason, when she almost jumped at feeling something wet touch her foot. Andrea looked down and saw a cat. Without a doubt, it was Mary's cat. The woman squatted down and began stroking Mars. It didn't bother her that his fur wasn't as well groomed as when he was with his owner. He seemed happy and purred so loudly that it even drowned out the noise of the city street. Without thinking, Andrea addressed the cat aloud. "Mars, you poor thing, will you come with me?" The cat meowed, and Andrea picked up the wet, skinny body, cradled it, and ordered a cab to the nearest veterinary clinic. Mars was examined, bathed, and provided with everything necessary for a comfortable journey. Nancy, of course, grumbled at her sister when she learned what she had done and asked, "And how will your husband and mother-in-law take to this stray?" Andrea confidently replied, "I have no doubt that they'll be happy." And so it turned out. Robert and his mother didn't say a word against Andrea's decision. A few months later, it became clear that the family would be growing. The doctor assured them it was due to the expensive vitamin complex, but the future mother was certain that the pregnancy was a gift for saving the pet.